across the nation.
A Senate hearing today looked into Russian efforts to influence democratic countries through propaganda, cyber attacks, money laundering, and military threats. Witnesses included a former president of Estonia and former state and Homeland Security Department officials. This is 2 hours.
Thank you all. The hearing will come to order, and I appreciate Senator Whitehouse and how we've worked together to get here, and all the subcommittee members who participate. A little housekeeping. I will soon announce our panel and mess your names up, so I apologize. So if I butcher your names, I apologize in advance. We'll do 7-minute rounds. I'll swear in the panel just in a second. But I wanted to kind of make an announcement. We apparently were informed by the FBI just a few minutes ago that they would be responding to our letter, the letter that Senator Whitehouse and myself sent to the Department of Justice and to the Director of the FBI, March 8th, 2017, that they would be responding with a classified briefing, I think, to the chair and ranking member. We'll give you more details as they become available to us. But this letter was a pretty simple request. Was there a warrant issued by any court anywhere in the United States allowing the surveillance of the Trump campaign, Trump Tower, or any Trump operative during the 2016 election? And please provide the information that was used to obtain a warrant. If a warrant was requested and denied, we'd also like to know that. So apparently the FBI has contacted my staff that they will be at some date in the future providing us an answer to this in a classified manner. And with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Whitehouse if he'd like to respond for a second before we move forward.
I think one of the things that we have tried to do here is to proceed outside of a classified setting. The intelligence committees are working in a classified setting. The added value I think that this subcommittee's work provides is to be able to have a public discussion. If a small town wakes up one morning to find that all the shop windows on Main Street have been smashed, it is appropriate, and indeed it is incumbent on the police chief to reassure the town that law enforcement will be looking into that incident. It's even legitimate to say, here are the people I've assigned to it. And it's certainly legitimate to say, and we intend to get to the bottom of this. In my mind, the unclassified intelligence community report is smashed windows all up and down Main Street. And it is now not only appropriate, but incumbent upon law enforcement to say, we are looking at this, we intend to get to the bottom of this, and we have these resources dedicated to accomplishing that purpose. That is an entirely appropriate act for law enforcement in those circumstances. It has added significance when you are dealing within our constitutional separation of powers. It is not, in my view, appropriate for the executive branch of government to either tell or suggest to a legislative investigative subcommittee that they should hold back or not proceed or otherwise restrain themselves in our legitimate investigative function, one which President Wilson years ago said indeed was to be even preferred to our legislative function, in order to not compromise ongoing law enforcement investigations, and at the same time not confirm that law enforcement investigations are ongoing. That is a recipe for having the ball plop between the second baseman and the shortstop. We are entitled to investigate under the Constitution. They have executive responsibilities, and if we are only connecting with one another in a classified fashion, I don't think that serves the public interest. So we will pursue this further, but that's my initial reaction to this news.
And I will just build on that. Senator Grassley and Wainstein, the chair and ranking member of the committee, have been very supportive of this subcommittee. I just talked with Senator Grassley a few minutes ago, and I think there's an attitude on the committee that we need to get answers for the American people appropriately in an appropriate fashion. So what are we trying to do? The current president says that he believes that the former president, maybe not personally, but the former president through the government, surveilled his campaign in 2016. As a matter of fact, today they said they're extremely confident there was some kind of surveillance of the campaign. I have no evidence for that, but I can tell you this. That question needs to be answered because I don't think it's ever been raised before. And the bottom line is a lot of Americans are wondering what's going on here. So what I'm trying to do is get answers to the questions raised by President Trump. He's asking us to investigate, and we will. And to me, it's very reasonable to ask the FBI and Department of Justice, did you ever seek a warrant? Was a warrant obtained from any court anywhere about the Trump campaign? If the answer is no, then we'll know that didn't happen. If the answer is yes, that would be pretty stunning to me because they would have to have probable cause. I don't know what the answer is, but I know it's the right question to ask. The second thing, we met with the director, I think, on March the 8th, and we said, Senator Whitehouse and myself, that we want to know if there's a criminal investigation of the Trump campaign and ties to Russia because we're about to launch an investigation into all things Russia regarding the 2016 election. I don't want to compromise your investigation. I don't want to get in the way of your investigation, but the Congress is proceeding fairly blindly here. I think we would all be better off as a body if we knew that there was an investigation or not. If there's not one, we'll take that into consideration about how we might do things differently. If there is one, we don't want to run afoul of it. I don't think that is an unfair thing to ask. We gave the director until today to answer that question, and all I can say is I still don't have the answers to those questions. I like the director of the FBI, Comey. I think he's a fine man. The Department of Justice has a responsibility here too. So I just want to let the American people know that this subcommittee, with support of the chairman and the ranking committee, that we're going to get an answer to whether or not the Trump campaign was surveilled, was a warrant ever requested, was one issued, and I hope to be able to answer the question, is there an active investigation on the criminal side of the Trump campaign regarding ties to Russia? Director of National Intelligence Clapper said a couple of weeks ago that he had no evidence of collaboration between the Trump campaign and Russia, but the best way to find out definitively is to have people in charge today with that responsibility to tell us. And we're going to get there. I don't know how we get there, but we're going to get there together. We're going to do it as Republicans and Democrats. We've got a ranking member and a chairman who support us. Now, the hearing today is to explain to the American people what Russia's up to. Russian officials have been on television pretty fiercely in the last couple of days, saying that we, the Congress, are demonizing the Russian government. What I'm trying to explain to the American people is that the Russian government in Putin's hands has been up to no good in a lot of places for a long time when it comes to breaking the back of democracy. That what happened here, and I'm convinced that the Russians are involved in hacking into the DNC and Podesta's emails. It wasn't a 400-pound guy sitting on a bed. It was the Russians' intelligence services. I'm confident they shared it with WikiLeaks. And to my Republican colleagues, it could happen to us next. So my goal is to make a case that we're not demonizing Russia, we're exposing what they do in their efforts to break apart democracies all over the world, that we make a case that they should be punished for what happened in 2016 to deter other foreign powers that may want to interfere in future elections. So with that, we have a great panel, and if you would all please rise.
Let me make my statement.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, do the swearing.
Swear, yeah, okay, go ahead. Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give before the committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Now, Senator Whitehouse.
Propaganda, espionage, blackmail, subversion. The 21st century versions of these are fake news, hacking, compromat, and political capture. The Russians have been at this for a long time. They've adapted old methods to new technologies, making use of social media, malware, and complex financial transactions. But the purposes themselves are timeless. Over the course of the last decade, we've seen Russia manipulate the politics of other countries, undermine faith in Western institutions, and attempt to fracture Euro-Atlantic consensus. Last month at the Munich Security Conference, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov didn't mince words about his country's intentions when he looked forward to the creation of a post-West world order. That is a Russia-influenced order that stands opposed both to democratic ideals and free market economies. Senator Graham and I scheduled this hearing to begin a public conversation about the means and methods Russia uses to undermine democratic government. Their toolbox includes cultivating politicians through corrupt business deals and then threatening to expose the illicit arrangements. It includes acquiring control over vital economic sectors like energy to threaten and cajole dependent governments. It includes fake news and social media attacks, often based on network penetrations and the information illegally gathered from them. The declassified intelligence assessment released in January asserts that Russia, quote, ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. Senator Graham and I intend to hold public hearings to understand how Russia operates, what objectives it is pursuing, how those objectives may threaten our political system and democracy, and how this may or may not violate U.S. law. Gaps in our laws make us susceptible to many of the tactics we will discuss today. I'm pleased that President Ilves is here, that Ms. Conley and Dr. Buchanan and Mr. Wainstein are here. I want to particularly recognize the work that the Center for Strategic and International Studies has done. The Kremlin Playbook, of which Ms. Conley was the principal author, is a very significant and telling document. And let me welcome Ken Wainstein back to this committee. We have worked together on many issues. He was an adversary on some, I will say, but a principled and honorable adversary, and I'm delighted to have him back.
Thank you. We do have a great panel here. His Excellency Toomas Ilvis is the former president of Estonia from 2006 to 16. He now works for advisor for the Center for International Studies and Cooperation. I can't say the name. Bernard and Susan, how do you say it? Okay. Let's see. Center for International Security and Cooperation. And he's also at the Institute for International Studies. And as I said, the former president of Estonia. And he'll tell you what it's like to live in Estonia when the Russians are next door. Heather Conley is the Europe Program Director, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she wrote the book, The Kremlin Playbook, and we're in it. Dr. Ben Buchanan is a postdoctoral fellow, Cybersecurity Project, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. And Mr. Wainstein has been introduced. He was the former advisor to George W. Bush, Homeland Security Advisor, and former Assistant Attorney General for National Security in the Bush administration. Welcome all. We'll start with you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Honorable Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. In my prepared remarks submitted to you, I review the development of the tools of disrupting democracies as they have been used. First in my part of the world, Eastern Europe, and later in Western Europe, and ultimately elsewhere. To sum up my written testimony, we are under attack. It is an attack against Western democracies and on the institutions that bind them, the EU and NATO. This attack is at once asymmetrical, yet ideologically promiscuous. By the latter, I mean that an authoritarian regime supports both extreme left and extreme right parties that are both, or on both sides, anti-EU, anti-NATO, and anti-US, and it does what it can to undermine centrist parties and centrist politicians. It is asymmetrical because our democratic institutions, free and fair elections, rule of law, respect for fundamental rights and freedoms, especially freedom of the press, do not allow us to respond in kind. These tactics, disruption of the internet, hacking into parliaments, political parties and candidates, and more importantly, doxing or publishing hacked private correspondence, and ultimately spreading false stories or fake news, represent a new form of aggression. And I say it is aggression. Von Clausewitz said almost 200 years ago, war is the continuation of policy by other means. So why engage in military conflict if you can change democratic governments in order to follow policies you favor, such as, for example, lifting of sanctions for its occupation and annexation of Crimea? If the unity of the European Union to maintain sanctions or to stand up to corruption stymies your foreign policy, if NATO is willing to stand up for the security of its easternmost allies, why not foment anti-EU and anti-NATO and an anti-American sentiment by supporting fringe parties that share that view? We should be concerned. This year, we shall see elections of 3 of the 4 remaining large EU countries, France and Germany, and as most observers predict, a snap election in Italy. The Netherlands, a crucial partner in NATO and the EU, holds elections today as we speak. I should add that the Dutch so fear disruption that they have gone back to paper ballots, eschewing even voting machines. Disinformation, hacking, fake stories have all been used in these countries to support far-right and far-left anti-NATO, anti-EU, and anti-US parties and candidates, and against centrist transatlanticists, most notably Mrs. Merkel. Only in the past several weeks, we have seen the Foreign Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, also come under a fake attack. The age of the internet has allowed these practices to flourish, especially disinformation. Statistics in Europe are not yet out, but BuzzFeed here in the U.S. reported that in the last 3 months leading up to the U.S. election, fake news stories were shared on Facebook 8.7 million times, surpassing shared mainstream news by 1.4 million shares. Meanwhile, the Pew Center reported last summer that 62% of Americans get their news from social media. There's no reason to think that the statistics in other advanced democratic countries that are facing elections should differ from what we have seen in the U.S. And secondly, in conclusion, the other dilemma we face is that these threats from authoritarian regimes are asymmetric. That is to say, we can't do to them what they do to us. Authoritarian regimes control the press. They are not afraid of hacks or doxing that would show the corruption of their rulers. People never see that news. Fake news, as deplorable as they may be, have no traction there when the press is controlled. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter anyway if you count the votes in the end. Fake news, interference, and electoral processes we've observed already a long time ago in Eastern Europe are new to our NATO allies in the West. We used to have to jump hoops to prove fake stories about us were in fact fake. But now, I don't want to use the German word Schadenfreude, but now, in some senses, we feel redeemed, seeing that now more Western countries are facing what we have faced for a quarter of centuries. And I'll conclude, if you give me 20 seconds, with a quote from Jonathan Ayall, the director of the Ministry of Defense think tank, RUSI, in London. Quote, "We spent 20 years telling the Eastern Europeans that they were paranoid, living in the past, that they should treat Russia as a normal country. Now it turns out they were right. To prevent this from becoming an existential rift, to keep former communist countries still believing in the alliance, NATO is going to need to do a lot of clever footwork." Unquote. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm impressed with how well I understand Estonian. That was excellent. Ms. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. It is absolutely vital that we understand Russia's strategy of influence, how it works in our democracies, and to develop an effective strategy to combat it. It's so important that we recognize not only the tools that Russia uses, but we have to educate Americans on how to recognize these tools and to defeat their influence. Russia's strategy of influence is contained in Russia's doctrine, New Generation Warfare, of which its primary goal is to break the internal coherence of the enemy system. Russian influence works through a variety of economic and political channels, and it adapts to specific national situations, including biased news outlets, intelligence networks, Russian-financed non-governmental organizations, business linkages, and friendly politicians. While all of these tactical elements need to be understood in their own right, we can't lose sight of their cumulative effect and their overarching strategic objective, and that is the weakening of U.S. global leadership and its dominance of the international system. It's the weakening and ultimate collapse of NATO and the European Union. And finally, it is about the breakdown of the internal coherence, credibility, and moral authority of Western democracies. And once this coherence and cohesion is broken, a post-Western world can in fact be achieved. So let's be clear that Russia does not engineer the entire framework in which it conducts its strategy. It takes advantage of pre-existing institutional, political, and governance weaknesses and exploits them. So in fact, we must look to ourselves and our rules and our laws to help defeat Russian influence. So CSIS, in cooperation with our Bulgarian partner, the Center for the Study of Democracy, focused on how Russian economic influence impacts 5 European countries. I asked that a copy of the report be submitted for the record. We describe Russian tactics as an unvirtuous circle of influence. It takes hold of democratic societies through 2 channels: political and economic influence. The political influence can come through anti-European and fringe parties. It can go through individuals, possibly businessmen who've turned politicians, non-governmental organizations. It can spread through information wars and even the Russian Orthodox Church. The economic channel is more powerful in some respects. It works through a network of Kremlin insiders, former intelligence officers, and local oligarchs to manipulate and dominate strategic sectors of a country's economy. And our report looked at how both of these channels, both the political and the economic, work together. And what we found is that corruption is the key and principal conduit for the impact of Russian influence. And the reason that they go after those strategic sectors like energy, like finance, is that's where there are the biggest opportunities to exploit and use corruption. But what has allowed Russia's strategy to be so successful is Western susceptibility and in some ways complicitness with Russia's exploitation. And we found this over and over, where we're not influencing and impacting our own transparency laws, our beneficial ownership, abuse of funding for political party financing and non-governmental organizations. It's in fact in our power to stop these Russian tactics. So in our report, we recommend that our first line of defense is strengthening Western democratic institutions and societies. We believe that the Treasury Department will play a critical role in how we combat Russian economic influence by tracking and tracing illicit Russian-linked financial flows. We encourage strongly a very robust cooperation with the European Union in fighting fighting these corrupt practices, strengthening the independent judiciary and independent media and governance practices of our NATO allies. Building and strengthening financial transparency requirements and beneficial ownership will go an extraordinary way to prevent these corrupt practices to further Russian influence. Finally, I'd like to say in our U.S. embassies, we need to start thinking of our legal attachés as perhaps playing as critical a role in defending the United States as our defense attachés. Our national security and the security of America's most important allies rests on our ability to resist Russia's strategy of influence, and thus far, we have failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. The primary focus of my academic research at Harvard and at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is examining how nations use their capabilities for attack and espionage in cyberspace and the strategies that drive that usage. It goes without saying that Russia is a key player in this regard. So I'd like to make 3 points here to begin the discussion. First, we often think of Russian hacking as something that is new and different, but to do so is to be ignorant of history. There's a demonstrated pattern of Russian cyber operations stretching back several decades at this point. One major early case, sometimes referred to as Moonlight Maze, involved a series of penetrations for espionage purposes into American political, military, and economic institutions. That operation and the operations since then have shown adeptness in several ways. Perhaps most significant is that they demonstrate how the Russians have developed new digital methods to accomplish old tasks. The series of espionage cases show the Russian aptitude for gathering information using computer hacking. The 2007 attack on Estonia and the 2008 attack on Georgia are an exhibit of how Russia uses cyber operations against democratic states. Though we know somewhat less about it, the 2015 blackout in Ukraine, the first ever publicly known case of a power outage caused by a cyber attack, shows the potency of cyber attacks that appear to be Russian in origin. And the 2016 election interference demonstrates that the Russians have married their long-standing history of influence operations with their more recently developed capacity for hacking. The threat these activities pose to democracies and to their fundamental institutions deserves great scrutiny and often resistance. Second, there is a damaging perception that it is impossible to understand who is responsible for which activities in cyberspace. This is sometimes called the attribution problem, and it is not nearly the roadblock that it is sometimes made out to be. Alongside Professor Thomas Rid of King's College London, I spent a year investigating how it is possible to do attribution in cyberspace. After technical study and interviews with computer forensic experts in the private sector and in multiple intelligence agencies, we concluded that not only is accurate attribution possible, but that advanced nations such as the United States do it regularly. It is possible to do some form of attribution by relying on forensics data, such as language indicators, infrastructure indicators, time zone exploit indicators, among many others. For intelligence agencies, human and signals intelligence sources can provide additional vital information on the intentions of another state and can confirm attribution hypotheses. Rarely is any single piece of evidence by itself conclusive when it comes to doing attribution in cyberspace. Hackers do sometimes leave false flags to try to mislead investigators. Nonetheless, the United States intelligence community and private sector firms have overcome the attribution problem in many instances in recent years and have developed a strong understanding of how various nations, including Russia, operate in cyberspace. As early as the middle of last summer, the technical evidence strongly indicated that the Russians were responsible for the hacking activities against the Democratic National Committee and the related entities. The United States intelligence community report gives me still greater confidence in this assessment. In short, when it comes to many major Russian cyber activities, attribution is simply not an issue. Third, I'd like to close by taking a broader view. Every cyber activity takes place in a strategic context, and we would do well to remember that context when we analyze them and consider responses. Old strategic ideas, such as deterrence, do not go away when it comes to this new mode of engagement between nations, though they are often at first difficult to translate. Many of the Russian activities occur, I believe, because Russia has developed the capability to act, senses an opportunity to do so, and calculates that the benefits of the operation will exceed the costs. In short, we have not yet been able to devise means of deterrence in cyberspace that extend to the kinds of activities we are discussing here today. Establishing deterrence with our own cyber capabilities has proven challenging, in part because we have not always communicated our resolve well, and in part because we are rightly worried about further escalation. These difficulties are important and deserve strategic attention. We must find ways to better defend our vital computer systems, denying adversaries the opportunity to act. We must develop methods of deterrence that impose costs for significant malicious actions, and we must communicate those clearly. I am mindful of the lesson from history, sometimes called the security dilemma, that nations often unintentionally threaten one another as they preserve their interests. I have written a great deal about how the security dilemma can apply to cyberspace. And so I believe we must develop a strategy that protects our interests but does not unduly threaten other nations. Calibrating a response in this fashion is not an easy task, but it is a vital one. After what has happened this past year, few issues are more important than this right now. Thank you very much.
Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Whitehouse, it's a real pleasure to see you again. Members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. You're doing a real service by having this hearing today and highlighting what has really sort of gotten lost in much of the political controversy since last fall's election, which is that today we are facing an unprecedented and growing threat to democratic institutions around the globe. As my fellow panelists have eloquently testified, this threat is real and has already manifested itself in a number of different countries around the world, including in the nations of Central and Eastern Europe, in Estonia, in the nation of Georgia, and here in the United States, where the intelligence community assesses that elements of the Russian government-directed an influence campaign against our political system in 2016 that involved the cyber intrusions into state and local election board systems, the penetration of the DNC and the release of material to influence the campaign, the use of internet trolls to spread disinformation, and the launching of a general propaganda campaign to spread their preferred narrative around the world. Given the perceived success of these tactics in roiling our election, we should all expect to see more of them in future elections, not only from Russia, but also from other hostile countries like Iran and North Korea. So the threat is real and it's growing. The next question is, how can we respond to the threat? And the government has a number of tools at its disposal. First, it has all the national security investigative tools like FISA court electronic surveillance orders and national security letters, as well as the criminal tools that it can use to detect these influence activities. Second, it has the ability to bring a criminal prosecution against the perpetrators under, for instance, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for hacking into protected computer systems, or under the Foreign Agent Registration Act for those who engage in domestic political activities on behalf of a foreign party without registering as foreign agents. Criminal prosecution can have a meaningful deterrent effect, as we saw in 2015 when the Chinese finally agreed to an international protocol against cyber theft, but only after we had charged 5 members of the Chinese military with stealing American trade secrets. Deterrence can also be effectively achieved through the application of economic and trade sanctions, such as when President Obama imposed sanctions last December on Russia's 2 leading intelligence services and 4 Russian intelligence officials. And deterrence can be achieved through the ejection of a country's official staff from the United States, such as when the President ejected 35 suspected Russian intelligence operatives and closed 2 official Russian facilities at the same time that he imposed sanctions last December. Another option is the enforcement of campaign finance laws to prevent foreign nationals and foreign interests from contributing to U.S. political campaigns. With the recent reports of Russian funding for a French far-right party presidential candidate, allegedly in part as a reward for her supporting Russia's actions in Crimea, there is heightened concern that Russia may make similar attempts to sway American politics with campaign funding and contributions. And a final area of focus is on the protection of the electoral systems themselves, which was the purpose behind DHS's announcement in January this year that election processes will henceforth be designated as critical infrastructure, like the energy grid or the telecommunications industry, and other critical sectors that receive federal assistance and protection. So those are a number of the tools and capabilities being used to meet the threat. In light of recent events, however, we need to think of ways to strengthen those tools, and I'd like to flag 3 such ways. The first is to give the Justice Department statutory authority to get a legal enforcement injunction against operators of botnets that take over networks of computers and launch disruptive attacks, as we saw Russia do in Estonia in 2007.
As the authors of that bill, the chairman and I heartily agree.
I thought you would, sir. The second is to enhance the effectiveness of the Foreign Agent Registration Act by giving Justice Department attorneys the authority to compel suspected foreign agents to turn over records that show whether they are or are not, in fact, working on behalf of foreign interests. And the third is simply a recommendation that the government seriously consider the deterrence that is available under the international law concept of countermeasures, which are unlawful actions that a victim nation can lawfully take in order to persuade another country to stop victimizing it, like an example being a victim nation hacking back to persuade another country to stop hacking them. While this approach raises a host of difficult questions, I agree with the many commentators who encourage the government to consider such countermeasures as a means of deterring future foreign interference in our elections. So to conclude, we do have a number of effective tools and capabilities to meet this threat. The real question for today, however, is whether we also have the single-minded focus and the will to do so. All too often, we as a country have been slow to mobilize in the face of a looming threat, such as we were with al-Qaeda in the 1990s and with the cyber threat in the 2000s. It's my hope that we will not be slow in responding to this threat. This hearing is an important step in the right direction, but it's critical that we follow up with a resolute and decisive action. The threat is real, and it is not an overstatement to say that there is a lot at stake, no less than the continuing viability of democratic processes around the world. I want to thank the subcommittee again for holding this hearing and for giving me the opportunity to speak about this important topic, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. I note the arrival of our chairman. Senator Grassley, would you like to say anything? Would you like to go first?
One question I'd like to ask, and I'm going to put a short statement in the record.
Without objection. Since you fund us, we're going to let you do that.
Okay. I have a question of Dr. Buchanan. In your testimony, you asserted that accurate attribution for a cyber operation is possible. In other words, it's possible to figure out who was behind an attack. Is that true even if a sophisticated country is the attacker as opposed to a terror group or a criminal organization as other opportunities? I ask this because I would guess that countries like Russia, China, even our own country, have very complex ways of trying to cover their tracks in the cyber world. So help me understand how it's possible to accurately attribute an attack to one of those types of countries.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, my belief is that it is possible for a nation such as the United States to attribute the activities of even another sophisticated actor. This relies on a combination of technical means. For example, one of the strong indications that the Russians were behind the breach of the DNC this past summer was the reuse, it appears, of an IP address, so essentially an address relating to a computer between that intrusion and a previous intrusion into the German parliament in 2015. So nations have the capacity to look at these technical indicators, and private sector firms over the past year have done, in my view, a very good job of bringing those indicators out into public view. It also bears noting that nations such as the United States have the capacity to collect intelligence of our own using sources and methods of the intelligence community, which can be enormously useful in doing attribution and in confirming the intentions or the ultimate responsibility of who ordered a particular cyber activity. And that is a set of tools not available to the private sector, but that enables nations to do even better attribution, though often attribution behind closed doors.
I thank you for that opportunity, and Senator Whitehouse and Senator Graham for your leadership in this. I appreciate it very much. Very important that you do this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the support. Thank you for the Mr. Chairman, for the support you and Senator Feinstein have given the subcommittee. We really appreciate it. Mr. President Ilvis, when you were first in office, you took down a statute of who?
It was, no, not a statue of Putin, but rather a Soviet statue in the center of town that was causing lots of disruption.
So you removed a Soviet-era statue in the center of town, and what happened?
Well, we moved it actually to a military cemetery, which is more appropriate for a statue of a soldier. Well, I mean, all kinds of things happened. There were street protests, but then what we discovered one day was that none of our governments, well, not our major government sites, our online media, and our banks were not working. It was initially surprising because no one could understand, but then we realized we were under a DDoS, or distributed denial of service attack, which is usually done or generally done by botnets, which are networks of hacked computers. Most of the time, these are run by criminal organizations, and most of the time they send you Viagra spam. That is, they send out in all directions, but then you can redirect them to focus on single servers, which overloads them, and then they basically shut down. And that was where I said that given that there were criminal gangs doing this, then and the time was bought, that this was a unique form of public-private partnership, of which we have seen numerous examples since then, and most recently, I would say today, with the announcement of the Attorney General about people involved in hacking for money and for stealing money who are at the same time employees of the FSB.
Is it fair to say that during your time as president of Estonia, you were under constant attack in different forms by Russia?
Well, it came in waves, and I would say that in many ways it's decreased in the last several years as efforts directed towards first Ukraine, and then now, as we see, in attacks on French sort of mainstream politicians, attacks on Germany, most notably the Lisa case of last year, where there was a fake news story.
Right.
That we're kind of we're they're not
moving on. Yeah. What do you think the consequence would be, and very briefly, if you could, if the United States decided to forgive and forget what Russia did in our election? What kind of consequence would that be for the world at large, and what kind of signal would that send to Putin?
Well, I believe, sir, it would encourage them to continue, because it is precisely the goal of these attacks, not only here, but right now, ongoing elections and election campaigns in Europe, to put in place governments that would be friendly to Russian behavior in Ukraine, would stop sanctions and so forth.
Thank you. Ms. Conley, do sanctions work, you believe, when it comes to deterring Russia?
They do have limited...
Microphone.
They do have limited applicability. I think for the U.S. and European sanctions, the penalties on Russian long-term access to financial capital beyond 30 days has been important to it. But there has to be a full spectrum of deterrence measures, ranging from the military deterrence, and the fact that there's a NATO battalion deploying to Estonia is as important as sending strong messages about anti-corruption, signaling that we will fight the lack of transparency wherever it may be.
Do you think it'd be appropriate for Congress to impose new sanctions on Russia for what they have done in our election? Would that be the right signal to send from your point of view?
What I would recommend is that there's a full review of the entire spectrum of U.S. Policy responses to Russia, meaning we tend to silo our policy responses. We have to look at holistically. We have to look at what the long-term objectives will be for that. Sanctions are a powerful tool. They're an important tool. But if you do them just for every issue, whether that's Ukraine, the elections, I think you're missing looking at a comprehensive approach.
Mr. Buchanan, the problems we see with Russia, do other countries have similar capabilities to interfere with us?
I think it's fair to say that Russian capabilities are particularly advanced, but it's also worth noting there are countries such as China that have a long history of developing and using cyber capabilities, not necessarily against elections per se, but against a range of American targets.
If we forgave in Russia for their interference in our election, I don't believe it changed the outcome, but it definitely interfered. Do you think that would be inviting China and Iran maybe to come in later?
Certainly, I think that a forgive and forget strategy here would risk emboldening a range of countries, including but not limited to Russia. That would include China as well.
Mr. Wainstein, you go back to the Bush era. You've been dealing with this problem. The trajectory is pretty unnerving. What have you seen when it comes to all things Russia and democracy from the time you're in the Bush administration to now? And would you agree with the concept that whatever we've been doing in the past really hasn't worked enough?
I would definitely agree with that statement that we haven't done enough, but I would say that you sort of have to look at the historical progression. the Russians have been consistent. The Russians, back to the Soviets, have been consistent with their approach. And in a geopolitical sense, what's bad for the U.S. is good for Russia in their eyes. And so I think what we've seen change over the years is there is now the technological means to intrude and interfere in internal elections processes in ways that they couldn't before because of the development of the internet. So you now have an ability to do what maybe they didn't have the ability to do back in the Cold War. You also have an area of opportunity now. They see possible daylight between us and some of our partners, so I think they're methodically looking at that daylight and trying to expand it so they can bring countries back into their sphere of influence and divide our allies.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Conley, your testimony focuses really effectively and kind of captures the Kremlin Handbook report with respect to Russia's efforts to infiltrate, corrupt, degrade, and discredit democracies. And with the last election, we know we've been added to that list. You described that there are two key channels for that operation. One is a political influence channel, which might include things like fake news or trolling or doxing or even using corruption to support those, as you point out. And the second is economic influence, bribery, corruption, money laundering, various wheeler-dealering that either buys or puts people in threat of being divulged as having been bought, people of consequence. In your view, if a country has experienced one of those two techniques, how alert should it be to look for the second technique?
What we found on the economic footprint, if in the 5 case study countries that we analyzed, if Russia's economic presence was greater than 12% of a country's gross domestic product, it was more likely that economic means were the primary channel of influence. Now, there were variations to that. If, in fact, there was a lower economic presence, that would mean the political channel would be the most viable. And again, these countries still had the networks, both the business, the intelligence and security networks that were used to affect. And in certain countries, we cite Bulgaria as an example where both channels were used to such an effect where one was supporting the other that it led to state capture.
I guess my question is, if you're a country that has experienced this Russian effort through one channel, should you be looking for the same effort on the other channel? Is one an indicator to look out because they may be coming at you on both channels?
One channel supports the involvement of the other until they basically come together and become all-encompassing.
So it would be prudent for a country that has sustained an attack on one channel to be highly alert and look for signs of how the other channel might have been deployed also.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, and in terms of investigating the economic channel, are financial and tax records important to putting together the cases that can uproot the systems of economic influence?
Transparency is absolutely critical to breaking the strategy of influence and understanding where those sources of funding come from. They are designed to be hidden. They are designed to be opaque. For instance, if you look at Bulgaria, the country that is the most significant provider of foreign direct investment.
Let me jump in
sure.
away from, I love Bulgaria, but let's look at the United States for a minute. You've talked about the pre-existing weaknesses that the Russian effort exploits. Would one of those pre-existing weaknesses include legal structures that are non-transparent, or to use your words, have lax ownership disclosure requirements?
It's extremely vital to understand beneficial ownership of companies that are participating in major procurements. That is certainly an important vehicle. It's very important to understand where the funding is going.
And in terms of money laundering, understanding beneficial ownership so you can penetrate shell corporations is also important, correct?
Yes, it is.
And are you familiar with what the EU has recently done with respect to beneficial ownership and shell corporations?
Yes, we do follow the EU
so
closely.
They've recently cleaned that up considerably, haven't they?
They are working on, in fact, it's both a G20 initiative to try to prevent tax havens, to help open that up. Investigative journalism has also done an extraordinary amount. The Panama Papers were very illuminating, in particular to our report.
And your recommendation is that we strengthen financial transparency requirements.
Absolutely. It has to be an international effort.
President Ilves, you have the same thing. Part of what you recommend is that it's very important to investigate money laundering. If you're going to investigate money laundering, you have to have access to financial records, correct?
Absolutely.
And you have to have, it would help to have access to tax records to understand the financial picture of individuals who might be involved in the matter.
True.
And shell corporations whose true ownership is indeterminable, how do they function? Are they a hazard, or do you need to be able to look at beneficial ownership, true ownership of corporations in order to understand the economic manipulations?
Absolutely, because you don't know why something is happening unless you know who is the owner. And we've seen these cases across Europe, and not only in, say, the energy field, but also in real estate, but also even in the media, where we're not sure who owns a newspaper, for example.
And Mr. Wainstein, in your work at the Department of Justice and elsewhere, you understand that economic influence and corruption is a Russian tactic here. You say in your testimony, I understand, that it's important, to use your words, to acquire relevant records, such as financial records, in order to effectively understand the danger of the tactic of corruption. Is that correct?
Absolutely, sir.
And that it's also important to be able to produce business records to be able to look through and see what's going on?
Absolutely, yes.
And would tax records be a form of financial and business records that are useful to investigators as they try to determine the scope of the economic influence operation?
Sure. As you know, tax records are a very sensitive topic, and there are special rules about the handling and availability of tax records for prosecutors.
But from an investigative point of view, they're pretty vital.
From an investigative point of view, they're obviously helpful.
And shell corporations whose true ownership can't be determined, is that a good thing to have in this world?
Well, there are a lot of values at play, but obviously from the investigative perspective, the more you know about the entities out there that might be doing some wrongdoing, the more you know, the better, no question.
And it is, you know, from your prosecutorial experience, that very often somebody with a malign purpose will run their operation through not just one shell corporation, but a shell corporation behind a shell corporation behind a shell corporation to hide their hand.
Absolutely. Many of them are multi-layered, and it takes a lot of work to get to the bottom of them, and often you're just not able to. And
often you're just not
the
able.
perpetrator succeeds in asking what he's doing.
And if the perpetrator is a foreign nation trying to hack our democracy, that's pretty darn serious.
That's serious.
Thank you.
Senator Sass.
Mr. President, can you help us understand your view of Putin's timeline with regard to an endgame in NATO? And to what degree do you think the Europeans understand what his objectives are with regard to NATO?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Well, I think it's hard to say what the timeline is, but the goal is clear that as long as the EU and equally and more importantly NATO is united and maintains its current membership, then policies of an entity that is much larger, much richer, much more powerful than Russia leaves Russia in at a disadvantage. If you break up NATO, then every country except for the United States is going to be smaller than Russia. If you break up the EU, then the largest country in the EU at 80+ million people is Germany, and compared to Russia, again, it's small. And then when you think of NATO with countries like mine, then we're quite minuscule and would be at a distinct disadvantage. Now, that's the goal, I would argue, and has been the goal for a while, because if you read even Yeltsin-era op-ed pieces or opinion pieces, Russia does not wish to deal with a European Union, but bilaterally, and so too, of course, NATO has been a bête noire ever since 1949. So again, it's hard to say what the timeline is, but certainly with the amount of pressure we see today put to crucial elections this year in Europe, where support is going every time to anti-NATO, anti-EU, and anti-US fringe parties, basically, and with success, that this is part of the plan. And were you to, for example, get France to step out of NATO and the European Union, that would be a death blow or near death blow to both organizations.
Do you think there's been an acceleration in his ambitions from first trying to cause panic and understandable paranoia among smaller near neighbors to striking deeper into Europe, where it seems like public understanding of the historic significance of NATO is on the wane?
I think he was surprised by the success that they met with the Ukrainian crisis, in which they actually managed to penetrate serious so-called objective news sources, where you saw the BBC repeating propaganda lines on Ukraine to so-called balance the reporting from Ukraine. So repeating stories about that were purely fake as sort of as the kind of balancing side. And I think that encouraged them, saying it works. It really does work.
Thank you. Ms. Conley, I want to ask you some questions, but I'd just like to acknowledge the chairman reset my 5-minute clock. So I'd like to say thank you, and I'm going to use all of my extra time. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Only for you.
Ms. Conley, can you tell us a little bit about Putin's internal political constraints with regard to the illicit economy? Are there shades of gray inside the illicit economy of some of his cronies who are worried about the adventurism and think that in industry X, Y, or Z, this is more dangerous than people who just like his distraction tactics to prop himself back up at home with the adventurism?
Thank you, Senator. Well, the Russian economy and President Putin's management of it has stabilized the economy for now. The long-term trajectory is quite dire. It appears that the Siloviki, this sort of the inner circle of their business interests, have remained fairly stable. There is certainly changes, cannibalization, if you will, of different companies nationalized to maintain benefits, but the economy is under great strain. What we found in our report, interestingly, in all of these Russian influence operations, there was a connection to President Putin's inner circle. So certainly enriching and continuing to enrich that small inner circle is very important. But I think there's a myth in some ways that the sanctions have had a devastating impact on the Russian economy. They have hurt them, but they have stabilized. He is working very hard. President Putin understands he's now having to harden. That's why he has created his own National Guard. He knows things are going to get very rough, but he is stabilizing the economic situation. He's ready for the long term and making sure that inner circle, which there have been changes, there's generational changes going on right now. He's passing leadership from his peers to another generation. He's sculpting them. So I think we have to understand their further enrichment is very important, but we're seeing impact of lack of payment to pensions and teachers. The social welfare system is crumbling, but the inner circle is being maintained.
How rich is Putin?
I have no idea, sir.
Any of you have any estimates, Mr. President? You're not usually bashful.
Well, the reports say 100 billion, but who knows? But certainly it's a lot.
And just to be clear, for the record, this is a guy who's a public sector bureaucrat for most of his life, and we think he might be worth on the order of $100 billion. There's no moment of significant private sector activity where he had a stake in a private equity company or something.
But this is a pattern repeated across the board among senior leaders in public service in Russia. I mean, we have press secretaries with $30,000 Swiss watches.
Mr. Wainstein, were you trying to jump in there? You know some of the history on the guy?
No, I'm a little perplexed how a public servant gets $100 billion in his bank. Wish I could do that.
I don't see that spreading through the Congress.
I know I'm at time, so just one parting question. How likely do you think it is that congressional IT systems have been infiltrated by Russian security services?
Unless you use two-factor authentication almost certain.
Dr. Buchanan?